Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us. The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is happy to announce that we have won 2 Garden Communicator International Silver Laurel Medal Awards for Best Podcast and Best Podcast Episode. We've also won a Garden Communicators International Gold Laurel Medal Award for a Best Podcast Episode. We'd like to thank Garden Communicators for their recognition.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones, unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. This podcast is being recorded on October 11th, 2024. Tim Johnson is the Chief Executive Officer at the Native Plant Trust. He leads the organization's 45-acre Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts, the Nasami Farm, a native plant nursery in Whately, Massachusetts, and the expanded seed processing and storage facilities to support the new Northeast Seed Network. The network is a regional initiative led by the Native Plant Trust to create a sustainable source of seed to meet the increased demand for native plants. Johnson has an extensive background in environmental horticulture and biological science from his longstanding career in conservation and botanic garden administration and leadership at Smith College. Johnson's affection for native plants was born from a childhood spent exploring the great outdoors in Wisconsin. His appreciation for the importance of protecting the rarest of plants is from his graduate studies working with threatened orchids on the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, Tim. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Tim is from Wisconsin, and I am a Wisconsin file, although I'm from Illinois. So, Tim, tell us about growing up in Wisconsin. Tell us about your career trajectory. What did you do academically and all that good stuff?
That's a great question, Hal. I really think that no matter what brings people into conservation or horticulture, I'm pretty sure that when you really get down to it and you go all the way back, they're going to actually have some memory of a loved one, of some exposure, even if they're the geekiest scientists who can tell you all those scientific reasons. I grew up in Wisconsin in a hunting and fishing family. Pretty much as soon as I could drive, my friends and I were out camping, fishing, hunting, going to the boundary waters. And that's really what fuels my relationship with nature, is this feeling of freedom and belonging that comes from a competency, but also a community. Over my course of my career, it's really shifted to focusing on plants and plant conservation, and in particular, back to people. So I have a degree in biology from University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I would have majored in anthropology, but the school didn't have a major in anthropology, so I minored in it. And then I delivered furniture for a year and a half before deciding it was probably time to go back to grad school, and ended up with a great group of orchid nerds at the University of Florida and never looked back. We had an amazing time. We worked with Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. I had access to some of the most amazing habitat I've ever seen. Wild alligators, water moccasins, and just cypress swamps crawling with orchids. It was the most magical time. And as I was finishing my PhD, I realized, I could really keep focusing on research and maybe make a couple of important discoveries. But what I really wanted to do was accelerate the rate of change that needed to happen to prevent the biodiversity loss, to improve our relationship with nature so that we could really help heal the planet. And so I started working much more with people and working with hearts and minds through organizations.
And so let me guess, based on your accent, I'm thinking you are more like from Madison than North Central.
No, I'm from Eau Claire, but I guess you could sort of segregate between more rural and more urban environments.
Yeah.
But I've lived all over the country, so I can usually mask it until I say Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And then it comes out.
There you go.
I really find it interesting. You're going to laugh when I say this, but I really like the fact that you said you were moving people as part of your career. Like that's
moving furniture. I was delivering furniture. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's so critical for people who are a global thinker to learn how to move and move things, because that's connected to you and your plants and helping to move them. And I'm not sure if you've ever put that together, but I like to pick those little things out that people do that really influence them and they might not even know it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, at the very least, you learn to be really attuned to when people are on your side and when they're not, right? I can't believe we're going to talk about moving furniture, but you end up in a lot of situations where you're in bedrooms or you're carrying heavy things up brand new wooden staircases, or you're utterly reliant on the help of strangers. I remember one time I had to get a queen-size mattress into the second floor of this farmhouse, and the farmer got out his bucket lift on his tractor, and he lifted me and the mattress up, and we pushed it through his window. And that was fantastic.
That's what I'm saying, that all of that is an imprint on you and your creativity and your ability to think fast, because you have to think fast when you're moving people's furniture. I just think it's really fascinating. I like that. I always like to say that nothing's ever a waste that we do in our lives. It's just another little piece of us that is forming the larger whole, It's good to help our experience later on in life, because that's what I usually find with myself, that I found that one little thing that I did when I was younger really helped me when I was older. And your work with seed, let's hear a little bit about that, the whole idea of saving seed and sharing seed, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah. So my scientific background really is in seed physiology. So when I was in graduate school at University of Florida, I worked on orchid seed banking, propagation, reintroduction, and pollination biology. So really focused on seeds. I find seeds just utterly fascinating. And again, I can go back to when I was an undergrad, I told a botany professor, plants are boring, they don't do anything. And I really came to sort of see in seeds the antidote to that. They are able to be dried down to 5% moisture. Humans are 60% moisture, and at 5% moisture, we're very dead. Seeds are able to last sometimes for decades in the soil, and in other times, they can only last 6 months. And there's physiological reasons for that. They're sensing the environment. They're responding to light. There's weed seeds that just in the turning of the soil of a plow, the fraction of a second that they're exposed to light, they actually know that they're close enough to the soil surface to germinate. And then, of course, seeds are how a lot of plants move around, in addition to, vegetative propagation and sort of breaking of nodes. and human activity. So I'm a seed physiology and seed geek by training. I usually tell people I love plants until they're about yay big, just little things. And then I kind of get bored with them, which isn't exactly true. After graduate school, I went to work for Seed Savers Exchange. I ran the preservation program there, overseeing the seed bank, the cultural preservation work, and then went to Botanic Garden Smith College, continued to do research while I was there. And now I'm at Native Plant Trust, where we talk about seeds every day.
Can you explain the difference for our listeners? Maybe not everyone will know this, but the difference between an orthodox seed and a recalcitrant seed.
Yeah, that's a great question. So these are two very unfortunate terms, I would say, that scientists use, and just goes to kind of the word soup that occasionally we use. As you say that, Eva, I just remember being exposed to them and being like, this is a terrible set of definitions. But anyways, orthodox seeds, generally, we can think about them as like behaving the way we would expect when it comes to being able to dry them and store them long term. So these are seeds that we can actually remove free water from them down to around that kind of 4 to 8% moisture content, and we can then freeze them and they don't die. And so what happens is we're removing all the free water. We're down to just structural water, the water that's tightly bound in almost like a solid state. And we've gotten rid of the free water, which if we freeze that free water, will basically form freezer crust. It will form shards of ice, which will lyse the cells and will kill the seed. So orthodox seeds behave effectively as far as conservationists are concerned. We can dry them and then we can freeze them and they live. Recalcitrant seeds are recalcitrant to that treatment, as in we cannot dry them or they die. And because we cannot dry them, we can't freeze them. So many of these are tropical species. This appears to be an adaptation for tropical environments where seeds hit the ground running. They actually need to germinate right away. Avocados are a great example of this, right? Very big seed, oily seed. And because of that, you can't pull the water out of them. And then we have things like oaks, which also are recalcitrant. We actually can't dry acorns and store them long term. They only live for about 8 to 16 months, and you can't dry them down. You have to store them in a refrigerator. So you can't freeze them for long periods of time. Oaks probably also have their origins in more tropical environments and have retained this recalcitrant behavior, at least recalcitrant from our perspective.
That's really those are great definitions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was helpful. Well, native plants, I have only in the last, I'll confess, probably 2 years has it really appeared on my radar, for the home landscape, etc. Looking forward to yanking up big part of the front yard and just all the garden variety stuff, eclectic as it is. Arborists can be pretty clunky with how they put their gardens together. It's great to see native plants continuing to escalate in the public's awareness. I notice on the website for your organization that you have a pull down where climate is talked about. One thing I've learned or continue to learn with native plants is that they are a fantastic carbon sink. So along with trees and along with soil, native plants are really doing their job as well, as are the grasslands. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. But Hal, I want to ask you first, what put native plants on your radar those 2 years ago? What was it that kind of brought you to our side?
I think a combination of things. I would say I would start to see it on clients' properties and also my hometown of Evanston, Illinois. Regionally, I've noticed some towns and communities seem to have the buy-in. Like I'd be walking near Lake Michigan and see people's front and backyards completely converted over. And this is where I start to stumble. I'm not even going to be able to tell you, Rudbeckia, yes. Goldenrod, yes. Beyond that, don't ask me to name a third native plant other than, thank you. I think it's just giving up my mower was a thing, probably 5 years ago. It's like, I really want to get to that point where I don't own a lawnmower, gasoline, fumes, noise, the constant returning to the lawn. Yeah, so I think it was a combination of factors.
Yeah, we're hearing that from a lot of people that they're finding their way to gardening with native plants because they effectively want to have a lighter footprint on the environment. And there's this additional big bonus, which is I think as you start to garden or cultivate or even just promote and kind of encourage the native plants that are in your environment, I think we start to form a much stronger connection to land, and it helps us feel more in place. So these native plants that we have wherever you are, Native Plant Trust is focused on the plants of New England, but they have for millions of years adapted to each other, to wildlife, to fungi, to bacteria, to soils, to climate. And you end up with this incredible dynamic relationship. So we sometimes talk about habitat and forget that when we talk about habitat, we're talking about plants. We're talking about the things that plants build and put together. So from a climate perspective, I think most gardeners will know the adage of right plant, right place. We tend to kind of think about that like what grows good in the northern, shady, wet spot of the yard. But the ultimate expression of right plant, right place are the native plants that want to be in your environment, even if it's a heavily modified one. As gardeners, as landscapers, we have this additional opportunity to kind of play. So my house, I like to talk about the yard that I have. We're in a subdivision. I think that what happened is all the topsoil was scraped off one side, moved to the other side. It happens that my side is the scraped side. So it's very sandy. Managing a lawn would mean lots of water and lots of fertilizer, right? In addition, there's no shade trees. So I can either continue to fight that and just water the snot out of it and fertilize it and worry about how uniform it is, or I start looking for, up on that hill where it's really sandy, there's a lot of little blue stem, right? Maybe this site really wants to be a little blue stem prairie. And rather than having the blue spruce in my backyard that's now starting to fail because it's getting a little too shady and it's a little too wet, and so I get the pine needle diseases on it, maybe what should be here are some nitrogen fixing natives like redbuds or like honey locust. And so there's an opportunity to sort of source from our native environments, from nature-based solutions to our gardening problems, right? As you mentioned, there are definitely climate change benefits, both from a more general perspective. So I'm putting trees in that add shade. That reduces the amount of water I need to put in. It also reduces the temperature that my house reaches. It's better for human health in urban environments. Or we can talk about specific species, which is now my yard becomes an extension of nature. And the biodiversity that's in this collective pool is what will allow nature to continue to evolve, to adapt, to survive the climate crisis.
I think that you have hit on a couple different things that I think are really important. The one, when you were saying, planting something that is native to that area, it's also part of the connectivity of the landscape.
Yeah.
That you
100%.
are connecting those nodes with other nodes all around you, which makes a huge difference when it comes to migration and when it comes to when people are looking at the landscape. It doesn't look abrupt. It looks smooth and easy to understand or read, as they say, reading the landscape. Something else that you said that I remember my former professor telling me that when he first came to the United States, one of the things that he was told and believes that if you connect yourself with a native plant, you have rooted yourself in your new location. And I really like that idea that when you connect with something that is from that area, you now feel more like you belong. And that belonging is really a wonderful feeling for people who are coming from other places around the world. Just knowing, say, every time I see an oak, okay, I know that I'm home, or I see this particular plant, I know that I'm home. That's a really good feeling. So those are the two things that really struck me when you were talking.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I don't want to downplay the size of the climate crisis. It is very real. It's the largest challenge our species has ever faced. It's the biggest problem we've ever created. And yet, I know that without a sense of optimism and a sense that what we do actually can matter, we're not going to change. And one of the things that I always love to hear and hear often from native plant gardeners specifically is that this feeling that planting natives is something that they're doing. And not only is it something that they're doing, but that it changes their other behaviors, as Hal was talking about. You plant native plants and you start to think, do I need to fertilize that with synthetics? Do I need to spray that? Where should I be buying these plants from? How should I manage the rest of my lawn? Does it make sense to have that patch of lawn if I have this wonderful patch of habitat? It's one of these things that empowers us. As one of our board members told me recently, that when she feels like there isn't anything she can do about the climate crisis, she just plants another native plant.
Well, that's interesting.
Horticulture therapy.
And it doesn't villainize the non-natives, because a lot of non-natives do very well here. It's just the fact that, putting in more of the natives, because we've got so far away from them for such a long time, that we did have these abrupt areas where things didn't look like the rest of the landscape, and it became very difficult. And I think that that's something I talk with my students about. If you're going to have some non-natives, then make sure you have natives that tie in with the rest of the landscape, because then it's going to work.
Yeah.
And it really makes a huge difference from the habitat standpoint. Again, going back to migration, bird migration, other animal migration, it's really important that there's food sources for them when they land or when they arrive.
Yeah, I take a long view on gardeners, which is that once you're on the track of being a gardener, the worst thing to do is to intimidate somebody and make them stop. From our perspective as an organization, there's only kind of two don'ts. Don't plant invasive species, and don't use pesticides, especially neonicotinoids, right? And other than that, I have Ito peonies in my front yard. I love them. They're one of my favorite plants of all time. You're going to have a hard time getting those out of my landscape. But as you said, Eva, I'm also planting a lot of natives, and I really like that mix and enjoy it. It's an expanded plant palette, and I think every gardener wants a few more. Every painter wants a few more colors to be able to work with.
I like that. Yeah. I like that because I'm a painter. So I like, I'm an artist. So I'm like,
great.
The more color we have, the better. Because sometimes you look out at the landscape and it's very gray. And one of the things we're working on is a landscape down at Penn right now, and they want to bring some color into this area. It's all white. The whole landscape's white and green, but it's a memorial. And the idea of bringing in a few things that are native, but maybe an oddball variegated plant, or some other things that maybe not native, but they're going to work because it's going to bring pollinators in the wintertime. That's something you think about too, because we need to make sure that there's something all year round now, because the way it's warming up here and these little microclimates in the city, we need to have those things, because people now are having hives on their roofs, and they're having them in the little areas where they would typically not have them. They're going to need food sources.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about juxtaposition too. As a designer, and back to being a painter, there's a bit of color theory here. I was at Garden in the Woods earlier this week, and maybe we could talk about this as a season of brown, but when you really look at it, there's a incredible range of brown. The ferns are this wonderful cinnamony almond brown, or some of them are a purpley chocolate brown. Some of them are actually orange. They're not brown, or they're yellows in the colors of the trees. And so sometimes in our more flamboyant landscapes, you can't actually even see or appreciate that, or you miss. If I look out my back window right now onto the wildland that's in our backyard and it's dominated by little bluestem, it doesn't look like a lot right now, but in the morning when it's backlit, you see all those colors, the reds and the blues and the purples and the halos coming off of all the little seed heads. And so there's a bit of a sophistication that can come with appreciating these native landscapes. And also as designers, we need to do a better job of finding and showcasing the very best of what they can do, because it's a bit of a different design aesthetic than our primarily European approach to garden design.
I like that because, one of my friends from Australia, when we have our garden communicators event, she said, when I think of your landscape, because she never is here in the wintertime, she said, I never think of it as brown. I think of it as green. Lots of different types of greens. She said, but if you come to Perth, Australia, it's all browns and like reddish browns and yellow browns and lots of other things. And believe it or not, that's how designers like car colors came about, by looking at the landscape that the cars are in so that they're not too distracting to the landscape itself. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. You park your car in front of your house and it's not bright red, it's tan, or it's a soft green, or because that's what your landscape is like. And I thought, wow, I never really thought of that and you're saying exactly what I heard earlier. So yeah.
Fascinating.
One aspect of native plants that I've been thinking about a lot, because here in the Delaware Valley, we were really kind of in the midst of a pretty serious drought. And I just looked, no rain to speak of over the next 10 days, 10, 14 days. But I do like the idea, and I'm very much looking forward to establishing native plants on a larger scale at my place and for others, because it's going to reduce the need for the supplemental irrigation. Is that typically the thought with natives, that they have some pretty good drought tolerance?
Yes, many. I mean, we also have aquatic and semi-emergent, which are a lot less.
Yeah.
But if we were to go beyond the more conventional palette of the American urban landscape lawn, then yeah, natives offer a lot of opportunities. Kind of just like how annual wheat doesn't send down very deep roots. Once we're into perennial grains, they have very extensive root systems, and so they're accessing water that's much deeper. So our native lawns, for example, have very, very shallow root systems. Did I say native? What I meant to say was our turf lawns have very shallow root systems, right? In fact, we encourage them to have very shallow root systems by like sanding and watering weekly, because we keep all that moisture up at the very top. When we're into, again, I keep going back to little blue stem. I mean, dig up a plant, try to transplant it. You're going to find this huge mass of roots that are underneath it. And in those roots, you're also going to find hyphae from fungi that are intermingled into that as well. So that much more water that's more deeply held. And then it's also, as those roots are degrading, are breaking down over time, you're building the humus in your soil, you're building your water retention capacity within that soil as well. So there's very mechanical benefits of working with native plants, working with perennials, and working especially with like deep-rooted, tap-rooted types of perennials, yeah.
Coming back to lawns, you can also put things in that look like a lawn but are not a lawn, not the traditional green lawn. And I was thinking carex. Carex is used a lot here, and carex is extremely drought tolerant. It looks lovely and tough, but you don't have to mow it. It's there and it does its thing and it looks beautiful. Some of the carex stay pretty low even when they're in seed, and they look really attractive,
Yeah, I agree. Carex pennsylvanicum in particular is getting a lot of attention these days, very short. In fact, I was just in Iowa and saw a beautiful new renovation at the Vesterheim Museum where they had put, I think it was Carex pennsylvanicum, and it looked gorgeous, unmowed. Carex pennsylvanicum is one of Native Plant Trust's big success stories. This is a species that is actually very difficult to germinate. It has a compound dormancy requiring several cycles of dormancy breaking. And before I joined Native Plant Trust, I was reaching out to the folks at Native Plant Trust to see if they had seed, because I knew it was a problematic species. And I said, I'm trying to figure out how to germinate it. And they said, well, we'll give you seed, but we already know how to germinate it. And so our crack team here was able to figure out how to go from about 3% germination to over 90%. That means that in the production of Carex pennsylvanicum, you don't have to rely on vegetative propagation. We can actually maintain the genetic diversity while we're filling orders for thousands of plugs. So that's just one example of sort of the work that Native Plant Trust has done and how our horticulture, science, and ecological minds are coming together to solve problems.
And I'm sorry, the institution in Iowa, what was that you were at?
Vesterheim. The Vesterheim is a Norwegian-American museum in Decorah, Iowa.
Just recently, we were talking about dormancy, and I can't remember who it was that I was talking to, but they said that they've discovered that if you get the seed just before it's totally ripe and then try to germinate it, that's usually when you could germinate it right away. If it starts to go past or flickers to the drier side, that's when it goes into those dormancies that are harder to break. So I thought that was really fascinating. I think it was at North Creek Nursery where they were talking about that. And they're masters at getting all these different types of grasses to germinate. And they have these orchards of seed that they can just go to, and they have it on their calendars, marked on their calendars when they have to go to get it so that they don't miss that mark. And I really think that that's critical for a lot of seed. And gentlemen we were talking to in California said, it's the 15th of September, and this is the day and the week that I go to the school that has our one tree that we get all our acorns from for such and such a species. So those are the kind of things you think about. And definitely, if you have a dormancy cracked because you've done this scientific work, that's brilliant. And that really makes a huge difference for quick germination and out into the public space.
Eva, you're talking about the way that seeds ripen and mature. There's a couple of different physiological processes that aren't all happening at the same time. For example, when a seed is mature enough where we say that it's competent to germinate, basically like it can survive and it can grow, isn't always the same point at which dormancy sets in. In a lot of species, dormancy is actually sort of being the thing that's delaying germination is usually happening later. So it could be that it's a hard seed coat, and so it just the seed has to lose more moisture, or it could be that it's a physiological dormancy, and it's only later in the seed's life that the carpel is pumping that embryo full of abscisic acid. The trade-off here is that in a horticultural setting, that works really well when you're trying to produce plants. In a conservation setting, especially when you're doing work that Native Plant Trust is doing with seed banking, you actually shorten the life of that seed. So we need it to go through the natural ripening and maturation process. We need it to acquire that dormancy so that we know it's all the way mature and ripe and can be dried and stored, right? Because if we do it earlier, when we pull the water out, we can actually kill that seed. So
right.
One of the most important projects we do is seed banking. We have the seed bank of rare plants. We have over 2,000 accessions in that seed bank. In fact, we just completed a challenge to raise $1 million for the endowment to be able to continue to do that rare seed work, thanks to generous donors.
Well, congratulations.
That's wonderful. Yeah,
that's
congratulations. Because
wow.
that's an important component. The one gentleman up in, I think it was Steve Kiskela from British Columbia, said that they have seed that they collected 65 years ago, and it's still in their collection. But what they do is they bring out a little bit at a time to make sure that they have mixed provenances when they go to have it planted, so that there's always like back genetics that are being crossed in the younger genetics of right now. And I think that's very, very fascinating that they can just keep doing that and prolong and change the genetics of a plant. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, our conservation seed banking program is focused on not just species. We're really working on conserving the genetics of specific populations, or what we call elemental occurrences. Mm-hmm. And so there's an interesting algorithm for how we make choices about how do you start to build that collection. If you can't get to every population, where do you begin? Once you've made your core collections, how do you make those secondary collections? And then we get into seed testing. And just because we have seed doesn't mean we know how to germinate it or that we know it's alive. And so there's a lot of research and monitoring and maintenance that goes into seed banking over a long time.
So there's a lot of record keeping.
There is, yeah.
So with 2,000 acquisitions.
Accessions, yes, accession. So close.
Yes. That speaks to me that you must engage with a lot of other organizations. Is that right? Other botanical gardens and such?
That's right. One of the core, I would say, values of Native Plant Trust is collaboration. We work very, very closely with the state botanists throughout New England, with the natural heritage programs, with colleges, universities, botanic gardens, nonprofits, as well as citizen scientists who are helping us. We're monitoring rare plants in the wild. We can't do that without their help. We're collecting seed in part for those states that don't have a centralized seed bank. So we're serving this really important interstitial role. The other thing that we're doing that I think is a great model for all the regions, for any region, is that when we look at rare plants, generally we are using geopolitical boundaries to make decisions about rarity.
Right.
We can say, is it globally rare, yes or no? But often we're even saying, is it rare in the state? And when you look at the state, you realize, or when you look at New England, the plants don't really care about these geopolitical boundaries. So we might have a species that is at the northern edge of its range and just creeping into Maine, right? Well, should Maine spend a lot of money trying to conserve that species? Well, a little bit, it kind of depends on whether they've solved all their other problems, other challenges or not. And then we look at, well, if it's really prevalent in Massachusetts and it's really prevalent in Connecticut and it's really prevalent in New York, and it is just that it's range limited in Maine and perhaps it's marching north into Maine, maybe it's not a priority for the region. And so we can take a much more comprehensive look at conservation needs, which means we can be much more efficient with how limited money is spent on rare plant conservation.
That's really fascinating. Well, even like when we talk about some of the woody plants down south, I'm thinking of Fothergilla, for example, Zenobia. Those are plants that are very limited to the counties in certain states. And to expand those further north, they do really well up here.
Right.
We should be doing it because if anything happens in those areas, it could mean a total loss of a species, especially if it's a hurricane or salt inundation or some other catastrophic event that happens. A whole species can be lost in a blink of an eye. So what you're doing is critical for the longevity of a species.
Yeah, and you're hinting at the idea of assisted migration, right?
Yes.
And there are, especially when we're looking at mountaintop species, we're part of the Appalachian Range in this part of New England. And there are species that are being pushed up the mountain and they don't have wind dispersed seeds.
That's exactly right.
They can't migrate faster than climate change. And so the question is, what do we do? And on one hand, we have folks who might say, well, we should move them. We should put them into environments like Massachusetts, which is a lot like the Southern Appalachian Mountain Range. And there's other folks who say, well, if we do that, we don't really know what the repercussions are. Some of these species have close sister taxa in this region. Some of them are symbiotic with fungi. And so we're going to be bringing fungi into this environment as well. And so there's a bit of a raging debate about this, right? Should we or shouldn't we do it? I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here.
Please.
When we think about conservation, and I think that conservation practitioners really hold themselves to the Hippocratic Oath, which is to do no harm. Do no harm. And so that can mean that when you don't have enough information, the safest thing from that perspective is to do nothing. I was talking to a good friend of mine who's a doctor, and I said, tell me about this. Tell me about this Hippocratic Oath, this do no harm. He said, well, yeah, that's part of it. But the other part of it is that we're taught that when you can do something good, right? And there are times when you're going to have to do your best, even though you might end up doing harm, the intention is to do good. So if we sort of adopt that whole lens around try not to do harm, but try also to do good, I think also if we look at the long evolutionary trajectory, we need to try to preserve evolutionary lineages. And we might have to move things, and we might take advantage of moving them into gardens or into urban centers where they're already modified habitats. But I think the writing's on the wall that for a few species, we're either going to watch them blink out or we're going to help them move.
I think that's a really good point, because I think that's the point of a botanic garden or an arboretum, is to observe these plants over time. Now, for example, a good one is the Amur cork tree, the Philodendron amurense. That one there was known at Morris Arboretum to be pretty aggressive and just move out into where it shouldn't be. And they made the decision that, no, this plant doesn't belong here. So let's remove it because it was creeping into the local woodlands. And they were able to stop it. But it doesn't mean it's not going to be used on a street where it's going to be away from any woodlands, but it's going to be really tough in the urban environment. So there's a case in point. The other one is the live oak from Virginia. When it was brought up to Morris Arboretum, they were looking at trees and what to do. Could they use them in the city on Penn's campus, Penn's main campus in the city? And they started putting them in there. And wow, are they looking fantastic. After a couple years, they haven't blinked an eye. They're just growing like crazy. And I got some photos of them and I thought, okay, here's a tree that can stand the urban environment. And if it wasn't for them watching it at Morris Arboretum, it would have never been tried in the campus downtown. And it's doing great. And there's another tree that we can use in the urban setting that we might not have thought of using.
Yeah, I think that's a great story. We also, when I was at the Botanic Garden of Smith College, we put in a planting of what were supposed to be sterile hybrid Norway maples. And because trees in an arboretum get such close inspection, our trees were getting an annual appointment with the tree doctor to see how things were going. And we were able to detect pretty early that, actually, this plant is putting out seedlings that are germinating. Now, just because those seedlings are germinating does not mean that they themselves are fertile or that they would continue to grow. But it was enough of a, hey, this isn't exactly sterile realization that we were able to remove those trees before I think they became a huge problem. So you're right that Arboretum Botanic Gardens, especially operating in a more ecological lens, adopting ecological horticulture, maybe these are institutions that used to be about bringing in as much exotic material as possible. And if it's spread, all the better. And now you're going to be loath to find a botanic garden that isn't engaged in conservation work. And that means that they're keenly aware of the potential for invasive species and they're monitoring their collection and intentionally doing that work.
Yeah, this might be old news. I was unaware that Quercus acutissima is now regarded as a serious invasive. I was at a shopping center in Cherry Hill, New Jersey this week, and it was sitting out in a parking lot and basically mulched with its own acorns, all ready to go.
Yeah.
And then I did hear from a City of Philadelphia forester. He said, yeah, it's been dropped from the acceptable species list. And then finally, far south Philly at what we call the Navy Yard, a couple of years ago, I had taken notice that acutissima had seeded in remarkably well and created a monoculture of sawtooth oak. So it's a complicated topic, and it'll never cease to be otherwise. So many variables.
With the animal populations around here, you always see acutissima with a herd of deer around it, eating like crazy. And it could be on the edge of the city, it could be in the city, or it could be in the suburbs. But if there's an acutissima around, there they are. And turkey, too. We've had a lot of turkey, too, that just come real close to the city, and a whole flock of them, and they're eating. And that's their favorite acorn. Out of all the acorns they want to eat, that's the one they choose.
And if we're losing all our red oaks, then there's another argument. It's like, okay, well, here's a replacement oak to feed wildlife.
That's the other thing.
Tough one, yeah.
There's a pretty well-documented shortage of botanists in the world right now. State and federal agencies struggling to hire enough botanists or maintain funding for their botanists. But as you're pointing out, Hal, these things are right in front of our eyes if we have enough people actually who know what they're looking for. Native Plant Trust does a lot of courses around plant taxonomy, invasive species control, as well as landscape ecology, restoration. There is quite a bit that people can do. And especially for those of us who are homeowners, there's a lot we can do with our own homeowners. There's lots of nonprofits and community groups that are doing invasive removal, but there is a positive effect that can be seen on the landscape through vigilant removal of invasive species.
I think you're right about that. And a species like sawtooth oak is great in the dead of the city where it's not going to be moved by anything, but it's tough. It's as tough as nails. And in those places where you have a low-income community where they don't have shade and they do really well, maybe it's a good thing. Those are the kind of things that we're looking at here in the city of Philadelphia. We've just worked on a big list with tree tenders and, what should we put on the list? What should we take off the list? What are we seeing? But also at the same time that when we have a tree like Cornus cusa, where people are starting to see it getting aggressive, a lot of times it has to do with our change of climate, but also the birds are starting to eat it. So now they're carrying it, which they didn't do before because they weren't familiar with it. And when they had a shortage of food, they decided they're going to try it. And like, a smorgasbord that has a food that nobody's ever seen before, you don't touch it because you don't know and there's nobody to ask. But then when you're really dire, you eat it. And
That's a really interesting point. I think in particular around native tree cover, especially in marginalized communities, as I said when we started talking, shade has a direct impact on human health. It also has direct impact on happiness, on connectivity, on community. And if we're planting native trees into these environments, we don't have to actually worry about many of these issues around things like invasiveness.
right.
The other thing I want to point out, as you all know, part of these challenges with having barren boulevards in marginalized communities is that barrenness is actually a direct symptom of the lack of investment, because it's not just about putting trees in, it's then about having the experts there to keep those trees alive and to keep them healthy over long periods of time. So you need to, yes, plant more trees. We need trees everywhere, but we also need to invest in the arborists who can care for those trees, because otherwise they're just going to not make it again.
That's a good point. And I think what we're seeing when we're talking about low-income communities, a lot of people who can't afford to buy a house that used to be able to buy a house are moving into these neighborhoods. And they're the ones who may have connectivity with a university or something like that. And we've saw this in a lot of different places, like in North Philly and West Philly, Southwest Philly, where people moved in because that was what they can afford. And they actually help their neighbors. They actually start these neighbor groups. And next thing you know, they're planting. And it's because maybe one neighbor's thought process that brings in a thought about planting and health benefits. And like you're saying, we really need to think about those kind of things. It's important.
Yeah. I mean, don't you think, you both work in this industry? I mean, don't you think that cultivation is kind of something that's deep in the DNA of being human? Like, it just seems to me like that is get your sleep, eat well, drink water, exercise, and garden.
But no, you're right. I think it's really important that people realize that. And I think there's more people that would like to garden, but they don't have the space to garden.
And that needs to be addressed as well. We just had a guest on talking about urban soils and the potential for contaminants in older urban cities. But more and more, the beautiful opportunity to grow your own food, it should be available to everyone, including people that might live on the 12th floor of an apartment building. Somehow we have to continue to design green spaces so that you can get out and have your own little 4x8 raised beds and have access to leafy greens. As much of the growing season as possible. Tim, before we start to wind it up, you had mentioned a shortage of botanists. I thought that was interesting because I think, at least horticulture-wise, environmental horticulture, arboriculture, I think we're seeing young people kind of move into the industry. But I guess up the ladder a little bit, botanists are in short supply.
Yeah, and we can kind of think of these as disciplines that have a lot of overlap, but aren't necessarily the same thing. Botanists are the people who are working on species identification. They're working on taxonomy. They're working on phylogeny. And so they're not necessarily the people who keep plants alive. And the people who keep plants alive, while they're reliant on that knowledge, that botanical knowledge, they're not necessarily making corrections or updates or determining that's a new species or it's not a new species, right? So these are kind of sister professions. When we're working on conservation, when we're trying to figure out what we should conserve, the first thing is to figure out what is distinct. And are we talking about different species? Are we talking about a species that has a wide range of morphological variability? Are we talking about cryptic species that actually we can't tell apart except for when we look at their DNA?
DNA, yeah.
But we need to know what we're talking about because we don't want to, again, we don't have time to waste. We don't have enough money to do everything. And so we have to have a strong sense of what is out there. This is part of the reason why Native Plant Trust has over the years done two key publications. One of them is Flora Nova Anglia. This is the taxonomic treatment of plants in New England. We have an accompanying website called Go Botany, where people can actually get help with identifying species. There's dichotomous keys on it. And then the counter to that is, why do we do that work? Well, because it guides our decision-making around conservation. And so we also publish a piece called Flora Conservanda, which is the assessment working with all the states in New England about what the highest priority species are for conservation in the region, not just state by state.
You were talking about botanists and being a shortage of them. They cut so many of the botany programs that I think there may be just a handful of them left in the United States. And the other thing is in horticulture, they cut the term horticulture and put everybody into plant science and ecology. And so things have changed. So we don't have the same name. So we really don't know who is who anymore or what is what. And it's because of all these name changes that it has made it very difficult to find the people that you want that have all the skill sets that a botanist would have.
Right. And if people aren't quite sure why botanists are useful, maybe especially gardeners who we can have a pretty good mental dictionary of plants, right? We can identify a lot of them. Show them two very similar grasses and see if they can differentiate them, and they'll understand the value of botanists. You know, that point that we lost botany programs in the 1970s, botany and zoology were combined into biological sciences department. This coincides with really the rise of the molecular age. And in that molecular age, many of the model organisms were actually animals. And so plants kind of fell to the wayside. There's less to learn about human health from plants directly than from mice or from fruit flies, right? But as you mentioned, there's a lot of interest from students, from young people who are really craving to be reconnected with that. And I think we're starting to see some responsiveness to that. As you mentioned, the rise of ecology programs or plant science programs. Maybe these aren't quite as specialized as they once were, but I think that we're finding for a whole generation that wants to be active in solving the climate crisis, a lot of them are turning to plants.
Yeah.
And what really fascinates me, the other day I went to a conifer garden to see this collection, and it turns out that the gentleman who has this conifer collection is a radiologist. And my business partner was with me. And she used to be a cell specialist and determining cancer. And she was with me. We were walking around. And it turns out that she knew the wife who also was working in the same kind of field that my colleague was working in. They still do their work in the medical profession, but they shifted all their hobbies into the plant world, which I find really fascinating. So the wife said she can find witch's brooms very easily because when she looks at cells, she's looking for unusual clustered cells to determine whether there's cancer there. So she said, and I do the same now when I look up at the trees and determine that the pattern's not right. And I was like, blown away. You know, so here's somebody with a medical background who's bringing it into the horticulture background. So we're getting a lot of these crossovers, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, me too.
Just to confirm your work with the trust, you are collecting seeds from woodies as well. Am I right about that?
That's correct. And also want to mention that all of our work is done with affirmative consent. So we're working with landowners, we're working with state agencies who are giving us permission for use. So that is how this should be happening, yes.
Okay. And are you able to collect ginseng in New England?
Oh, golly, that's a great question that I cannot answer for you. But
I knew you wouldn't be able to.
The prior question around woody plants, and I wanted to go back to woodies and say that there's a lot of interest in increasing the supply of trees that are available.
Yeah.
Native, yes. And we're also at Native Plant Trust very interested in regionally adapted material, in ecotypic tree material. Most urban and suburban design installations are not going to custom grow that material. It has to be available to them when the project is shovel ready. And so we need to really make sure that there's an available supply before perhaps there's even a signal that it's going to be needed. Because otherwise, the landscape designers are just going to substitute it for something else. So this is a big challenge that Native Plant Trust is working on right now. We're scaling up our ability to do seed cleaning. We're doing some pilot plots. We're planning on doing some contracting with farmers to be able to grow regionally adapted seed material. And part of it is trees too, and wanting to be able to produce red oaks that are from Western Massachusetts, not just red oaks that are from somewhere.
Right, exactly.
Does the seed collecting nerd community, if you will, do you guys get together professionally? Is there a place for aspiring? Well,
yeah. I'm sure there is.
There is.
Coffee and donuts.
There is. Yes. So one of those places is Native Plant Trust.
Okay.
There you go.
But there's also a native seed conference that meets nonprofit, private partners that get together to do that. The Northeast Seed Network is a coalition of organizations and businesses that are interested in this problem as well, this challenge. There's about a 20-year-old, well-documented shortage of native seed for New England in general. But I would say that trees in particular, and there's virtually no availability of material of known provenance.
Great. What's the state tree of Wisconsin, Tim?
Oh, man, you totally caught me on that one. I don't know what the state tree of Wisconsin
I don't either.
is. I should know that.
Eva, can you?
Not Wisconsin. I know Pennsylvania.
Is it Buckeye? Or that's not Buckeye. What is Pennsylvania?
It's the hemlock, the eastern hemlock.
It's hemlock. Yeah.
They're talking about changing it because it used to be found in every county in Pennsylvania. That's why they picked it. And now, because of climate change, it's retreating, and because of woolly adelgid.
Wow.
And
maybe you shouldn't change it in that point.
That's what I say. That I wouldn't change it. And the other one that the state flower is laurel, mountain laurel, and that is also retreating because of the weather. So they were talking about changing the flower too, and I said I don't think they should touch them. I think they should leave them. But anyway, so what is your favorite tree?
Oh, I have many favorites.
Well, that's okay. You could pick from whatever state you were living in.
So I lived in Iowa for a long time, and the bur oaks really capture the imagination, especially when they're wolf trees and they really are spreading out. The bur oaks. Lived in Florida, the live oaks covered in mosses and orchids. Those big squat oak trees really transport me to different places. From a landscape perspective, I love, again, sandy soil here. So I love those nitrogen fixers. Redbud, redbud just reminds me of driving up and down the east coast of North America. And then I'll also throw in something that's not native, which is I'm a sucker for a paper bark maple. It's just a really well-behaved yard tree, and it has so much character and interest. So I'll just throw that one in there.
Yep. And that's
Griseum.
And I think you're the first person to say that.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. Tough one to plant 1 trillion of because they are grafted onto a different rootstock, and they're not the most abundant species in the wild, but they are a nice yard tree.
Ours, the ones that we have here are all from seed. And the one the one I have in my backyard, it's in a container right now, and it is taking off. I got it from Andalusia, the garden Andalusia, and it is beautiful. Oh my gosh. But the seeds are not real viable. So
well, I do have a healthy mix. I don't yet have one of those in my yard, but as I mentioned, I've got a number of red buds. I put a sourwood in the yard this year, which is also
that's a great one.
Stunning tree. That's one for the long haul. Effectively, it's a small yard tree because it's going to take it 50 years to get big, but a well-behaved and gorgeous native tree.
It is. It's gorgeous. Well, we're delighted that you could join us today and talk about the concerns that your organization has, and they're answering those concerns, which I think is so important for people to know that our plants are being managed by your organization, or the seed is, and hopefully you just keep growing your organization to the max. And I'm sure that that's what you're going to do while you're there as CEO.
Well, thanks, Eva. That is our hope. We can't do it without a lot of help, without a lot of support, without our donors and funders. But I'm with you. I'm very optimistic that we're going to continue to grow and that we'll solve these major challenges that we have.
And can you shout out your website? Can you shout out your website again for everybody?
Yes, nativeplanttrust.org.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Excellent. Tim, great to meet you, and thanks so much for your wisdom and insight.
Great. Thank you. Honored to be here.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The Planet A Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.